Waitress saw everyone ignore the Vampire King's mute son until she spoke to him in sign language. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. The restaurant was buzzing with the usual evening rush. Waiters and waitresses hurried between tables, delivering orders, refilling drinks, and ensuring everything was running smoothly. Among the sea of faces and voices, one person caught the attention of Emily, a young waitress working her shift. It was a boy, sitting alone at a table in the far corner of the restaurant. His eyes, dark and expressive, were fixed on the floor, and he appeared to be completely ignored by everyone around him. No one paid him any attention, despite the fact that he was sitting at one of the most exclusive tables in the restaurant. Emily had seen the child before, but never like this. His face was pale, his clothes simple and somewhat out of place in a restaurant filled with wealthy guests. His silence was striking. The more she observed him, the more curious she became. The boy looked to be about 10 years old, but there was something mysterious about him, something that made her instinctively want to reach out. She glanced around the room and saw the other guests, laughing, talking, and enjoying their meals, all without giving a second thought to the boy sitting there in plain sight. A chill ran down Emily's spine as she noticed the subtle tension in the air. She had been working at this upscale restaurant for months now, and in that time, she had learned to notice things that most others would overlook. But why was this boy being so completely ignored? Emily had learned a little bit about sign language from her grandmother, who had always encouraged her to be kind to those who were different, to those who needed help. She remembered the lessons well. Sometimes, the smallest gesture can make the biggest difference. Taking a deep breath, Emily decided to approach the boy. Her steps were hesitant at first, unsure of how to start the conversation, but when she reached his table, she couldn't help but feel the weight of his loneliness. She sat down beside him, not saying a word at first, just offering him a kind smile. The boy didn't look up. His eyes remained fixed on the floor, his hands resting motionless in his lap. Emily, with a soft smile, raised her hands and began to speak in sign language, the familiar gestures flowing from her fingers. "Hello," she signed gently. "I hope you are having a good evening." The boy's eyes flickered up, meeting hers for the first time. For a brief moment, there was no recognition, only silence. But then, his expression softened, and to Emily's surprise, he began to slowly raise his own hands, mirroring her signs. It was a small gesture, but it was everything. In that moment, Emily realized that something as simple as her willingness to speak to him, to acknowledge his existence, had made all the difference. The boy's face slowly lit up with a faint smile, and for the first time that evening, he wasn't invisible. There was a connection, however small, between them. The tension in the restaurant seemed to fade as Emily continued to communicate with the boy in sign language. As she looked around the room, she saw the faces of the other guests, who were finally beginning to take notice of the quiet exchange happening in the corner. They had been too focused on their own conversations to see the boy, but now, their curiosity was piqued. Emily could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the collective attention turning toward the boy and the waitress who had dared to reach out. What would happen next? Would the boy speak? Would anyone else step forward to help him? Or was this moment just the beginning of something far more significant? As Emily sat beside the boy, her hands still raised in sign language, a quiet calm seemed to settle between them. The boy, though still silent, slowly moved his fingers, mirroring her actions, forming simple signs in response. It was the first time she had seen him respond to anyone, and it felt like a breakthrough, something meaningful. Her heart softened as she continued to sign gently, offering him the kind of attention he had likely never received. "It's nice to meet you," Emily signed. The boy's gaze lingered on her hands for a moment before his own shaky fingers responded, forming the words, "Thank you." The simplicity of it took Emily by surprise. In that moment, she realized just how powerful communication could be, even without words. His response was small, almost timid, but it was real. The restaurant, still bustling with activity around them, seemed to fade away as Emily and the boy shared this quiet connection. For the first time, he wasn't just a silent observer in the background. He was a person with thoughts, emotions, and a voice, albeit through signs. Emily smiled softly, feeling a bond starting to form between them, a bond that had been absent for so long in the boy's life. As she signed once more, "I'm here if you want to talk," the boy's eyes flickered to hers, a hint of trust starting to build. The waitress gently placed a hand on the table, a gesture of reassurance. She could see the walls that the boy had built around himself, but for the first time, they seemed to be crumbling just a little. His face, which had been devoid of expression earlier, now showed a glimpse of hope. He signed back, "Why are you kind to me?" Emily paused for a moment, considering the question. It wasn't just about the boy being mute, or the fact that he was ignored by everyone else. It was about recognizing that he was a human being, deserving of kindness and respect, just like anyone else. "Because you deserve kindness." Emily signed slowly, the words filled with sincerity. The boy's eyes widened slightly. He wasn't used to hearing that kind of response. In a world where people ignored him, where his father's power and wealth cast a long shadow over him, Emily's simple act of kindness felt like a breath of fresh air. He signed again, this time with a bit more confidence. "I don't understand. Why do people ignore me?" Emily's heart ached as she watched him, his hands shaking slightly as he formed the signs. She wished she could explain to him that it wasn't about him, but about the way people saw him. Isolated, different, perhaps even a symbol of something they couldn't understand. "Sometimes, people are afraid of what they don't understand," she signed softly. "But that doesn't mean you're not important." The boy seemed to process her words for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Emily wasn't sure if he fully understood, but she hoped the seeds of trust and understanding had been planted. Just then, a voice interrupted their quiet exchange. "What's going on here?" It was a sharp, authoritative voice, and Emily turned to see a tall figure standing near the table. The man's presence was commanding, and the air seemed to shift as he approached. The boy immediately stiffened, his face falling back into the mask of indifference he had worn earlier. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the man. Vampire King. The aura of power surrounding him was undeniable, and for a moment, she felt the weight of his gaze. But instead of speaking to Emily, the Vampire King turned his attention to the boy, his face softening for the first time since he entered the restaurant. "Adrian," he said, his voice gentle, yet firm. "Are you all right?" The boy, Adrian, nodded silently, his eyes never leaving the table. The Vampire King knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. The air between them shifted once more, but this time, there was a sense of connection between father and son, something Emily had never expected to see. The Vampire King turned to Emily, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he spoke again. "Thank you for speaking to him," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of gratitude she hadn't anticipated. Emily felt a sense of warmth at his words, but also a rising curiosity about who this boy really was, and why his father had such a protective presence over him. Before she could respond, the Vampire King stood, offering her a brief nod. "I'll take it from here." Emily nodded in return, her mind racing with questions, but for the moment, she knew her part was done. She had reached out, shown kindness, and in return, had sparked a connection that might change the boy's life forever. As the Vampire King led Adrian out of the restaurant, the atmosphere shifted. The other guests, who had been too busy to notice, began murmuring among themselves, their curiosity piqued. But Emily remained where she was, her heart still heavy with the knowledge that Adrian's story was far from over, and now, she had a small part in it. As Emily watched the Vampire King lead his son, Adrian, out of the restaurant, she felt a strange mix of emotions. On the one hand, she was relieved to have been able to speak to the boy, to have made a small difference in his world. But on the other hand, she couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was just the beginning of something much bigger, something she wasn't fully prepared for. The weight of the king's gratitude lingered in the air, but there were more questions than answers. Who was this boy really? Why was he so different, and why was his father, the Vampire King, so protective of him? Emily's curiosity gnawed at her as she finished cleaning the table where Adrian had sat. The quiet hum of the restaurant's atmosphere seemed louder now, filled with whispers from the other guests who had finally noticed the strange exchange that had taken place. But it wasn't just the whispers that bothered her. It was the nagging feeling that the boy, and by extension, his father, had secrets that no one would ever fully understand. Later that night, as Emily wrapped up her shift, she found herself standing by the back door, lost in thought. The rain had started to fall in heavy sheets, making the night feel colder than it should have been. Her mind kept returning to Adrian, the way he had looked at her with such confusion and hesitation, as if he had never been treated with kindness before. She had seen the way his face lit up when she had spoken to him, how his eyes softened, even if just for a brief moment. It was a side of him that no one else had seen. As she pulled her coat tighter around her, she was startled by a voice from behind her. "You're the one who spoke to him," a deep voice said. Emily spun around, her heart racing. Standing in the shadows of the alley was the Vampire King. His imposing figure loomed in the dim light, and for a moment, she felt a surge of fear. But then she saw the faintest hint of a smile on his lips, a contrast to the cold demeanor he had shown earlier. "I didn't expect to see you again," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I wanted to thank you for your kindness to my son." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "I didn't do much. I just spoke to him," she replied, still unsure of how to respond to the man standing before her. The king took a step closer, his eyes softening as he spoke again. "You did more than that. You showed him something he's never had, compassion." There was something in his voice that made Emily pause. "He's been alone for most of his life, treated as an outsider, even by those who should care for him. Your kindness was unexpected." Emily swallowed, trying to make sense of the situation. "I don't understand," she said softly. "Why does he need to be treated like that? He's just a boy." The king's gaze darkened, his expression hardening for a brief moment. "My son, Adrian, is not just a boy. He is a vampire prince, cursed to live a life of isolation. And the world around him has only ever seen him as a symbol of power, never as a person. People fear him. They see his curse, but not the boy inside." Emily's mind raced as she processed his words. A vampire prince, cursed to live in isolation? It was almost too much to comprehend. But despite the shock, she couldn't help but feel a deep sympathy for Adrian. He had been trapped in a world where no one saw him as more than his royal title. "But I don't see him as a prince," Emily said quietly, her voice steady. "I see him as a kid who's been ignored. He deserves to be treated like any other child." The king's expression softened again, and for the first time, Emily saw a flicker of something human behind his cold exterior. "That's what I've been trying to protect him from," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not easy. The world is full of dangers, and I've spent centuries building walls around him. He's not safe, Emily." His words were heavy with the weight of centuries of responsibility. "And now you're involved in his life, whether you realize it or not." Emily felt a chill run through her. She had no idea what she was getting into, but somehow, she knew she couldn't turn away now. She had already seen the boy, Adrian, as a person, not a prince, and she couldn't ignore the connection they had formed, no matter how small it was. The king studied her for a moment as, if weighing his next words carefully, "I can't promise that things will be easy, but if you continue to show him kindness, if you continue to be there for him, I'll protect you. I'll make sure nothing happens to you." Emily took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the situation settling on her shoulders. She had no idea what the future held, but one thing was certain. Her life had just changed in ways she couldn't yet understand. "I'll help him," she said finally, her voice firm. "I'll do whatever I can." The Vampire King nodded, his eyes softening with a mixture of gratitude and something else, perhaps relief. "Thank you," he said simply, before turning to leave. "But remember, Emily, you are not just helping a boy. You are becoming part of something much larger than yourself." With that, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving Emily alone in the rain-soaked alley, her thoughts spinning. What had she just gotten herself into? And more importantly, what would become of her and Adrian now? Emily had barely processed the weight of the Vampire King's words when she found herself waking up the next morning to the steady hum of the city. It was a quiet Sunday, the kind of morning where the streets felt peaceful, almost unnervingly so. Her mind kept replaying the conversation from the night before, the way the Vampire King had confided in her, his desperate need to protect his son, and the looming sense of something much bigger than she had ever anticipated. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just helping a boy. She was now caught in the midst of a powerful world she had no idea existed, and Adrian was at the center of it. Emily made her way to work, her mind racing with thoughts of the boy. What would she find when she saw him again? Would he be the same, withdrawn and silent, or had something changed after their brief exchange? The morning passed slowly, and the restaurant was quieter than usual. The hum of conversation around her felt distant, as though everything was happening in slow motion. Then, just as the clock struck noon, a familiar face appeared at the door. It was the Vampire King. Emily's heart skipped a beat. He walked into the restaurant with the same commanding presence, but this time, he was not alone. Adrian, his son, walked beside him, looking more composed than she had seen him the previous night. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she looked at the boy. There was something different about him now. Maybe it was the way he held his head slightly higher, or the way his eyes seemed to scan the room with more awareness. He wasn't just hiding in the corner anymore. He was standing tall, beside his father, and he was looking at the people around him with a quiet intensity. For a moment, the room fell silent. Every eye in the restaurant was on them, and the weight of the moment seemed to stretch on forever. Emily's gaze locked with Adrian's, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that wasn't just sadness. It was curiosity. He was seeing the world differently now, perhaps for the first time in his life. The Vampire King turned his attention to Emily, his expression unreadable as usual. But there was something softer in his gaze when he looked at her. "Emily," he said, his voice low but clear. "Thank you for last night." "Adrian," he paused, glancing down at his son before continuing. "Adrian wanted to come back here. He wanted to thank you in his own way." Adrian's eyes shifted to Emily, and he gave a small nod, his hands fidgeting in front of him. He looked nervous, unsure of how to communicate, but his gesture was enough. Emily smiled warmly, her heart swelling at the sight of the boy, trying so hard to reach out. She stepped forward, not quite knowing what to say, but her instinct guided her. "I'm glad you're here, Adrian," she signed gently. "I hope you're doing well today." Adrian's eyes lit up a little, and his hands responded, slow but sure. "Thank you." He signed back, his hands shaking slightly. It was a simple gesture, but the connection between them felt much deeper now. The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. The tension that had filled the room only moments before seemed to dissolve as the guests, still curious, looked at Adrian with a new sense of understanding. Emily realized that just by treating him like a normal child, she had allowed others to do the same. For the first time, Adrian wasn't invisible. He was seen. As the moments passed, the Vampire King spoke again. His voice quiet yet firm. "You've done something that I can't thank you enough for," he said, his gaze shifting to his son. "Adrian is starting to learn what it means to be treated like a person, not just a prince. And that means more than you can imagine." Emily nodded, not quite knowing how to respond to such praise. The weight of his words settled on her, but there was also a sense of pride swelling inside her. She had done something small, something simple, but it had made a world of difference to this boy who had been invisible for so long. The king's gaze softened, but there was an underlying sense of urgency in his voice. "You've shown him that kindness exists, Emily. But now we need to protect him. From the dangers that lurk in the shadows, from the people who would never understand what you've done for him." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She had known, deep down, that Adrian's life was far from simple, but hearing the king speak of danger, of enemies, made everything feel so much more real. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The king looked around the room, as if ensuring no one else could hear, before stepping closer to her. "There are people who would use Adrian's curse for their own gain. They would exploit him, see him as a weapon, and they'll stop at nothing to control him." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "I won't let that happen. But I need your help, Emily. Adrian needs someone who sees him for who he is, not for what he represents." The weight of the moment pressed down on Emily. She had already made a choice when she had reached out to Adrian, but now, the stakes were higher. She wasn't just helping a boy. She was becoming part of a much larger story, one that would change her life in ways she couldn't yet understand. "I'll help him," Emily said, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "I won't let anything happen to him." The king gave a small nod, a look of gratitude crossing his face. "Thank you," he said simply, before turning and walking toward the door with Adrian by his side. As the door closed behind them, Emily stood there, her mind racing with the weight of what she had just agreed to. The world she had known was no longer the same, and Adrian's story was far from over. The days that followed were a blur for Emily. The restaurant was busier than usual, but her mind was focused on Adrian and what the Vampire King had said to her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing, not just in the restaurant, but in her own life. Adrian's presence, the quiet boy who had once been invisible, now seemed to hang in the air every time she walked through the doors. She couldn't stop thinking about the strange and powerful world that had just entered her life. That afternoon, as Emily finished wiping down the last of the tables, the door to the restaurant opened again. This time, it wasn't the Vampire King or Adrian who walked in, but someone entirely different. A man, tall and sharply dressed, with an air of authority about him. His dark eyes scanned the room, and Emily could immediately feel the tension rise. He was different. His aura wasn't as warm as the king's, and there was something cold about his presence. He walked up to the bar and ordered a drink, his voice low but commanding. Emily couldn't help but watch him. There was something unsettling about him, a sense that he didn't belong in this world. She had seen powerful people before, but this man's presence felt different. It was as if he was on a mission, and Emily had the unsettling feeling that she was somehow involved. It wasn't until she heard the familiar voice of the Vampire King that her focus shifted. "Emily." The king's voice cut through the silence, and she turned to see him walking toward her, Adrian by his side. There was a new, serious look on the king's face as he approached. "I need to speak with you," he said, his tone firm. Emily's heart skipped a beat. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. The king gave a small nod, but his gaze never left the man at the bar. "I need you to stay calm," he said softly. "That man, he's one of the Inquisitors, a part of a faction that wants to control Adrian's curse, to use him for their own gain." Emily's blood ran cold. She had heard whispers about people who wanted to exploit Adrian, but to hear the king speak so plainly about it made the situation much more real. The Inquisitors were dangerous. They were the ones who had caused so much suffering for Adrian, and now they were here. "What should I do?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. The king's gaze softened for a moment, but his eyes still held a flicker of concern. "You're safe here, but you must be careful. They won't stop until they have what they want. And right now, they want Adrian." The weight of his words settled heavily on her shoulders. Emily had known that Adrian's life was dangerous, but now the full extent of it was becoming clear. She wasn't just helping a boy. She was caught in a war that she didn't fully understand. "What do we do?" Emily asked, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to steady herself. The king leaned in closer, his voice low but resolute. "You stay close to Adrian. Be there for him, as you've already shown him. He needs someone who sees him as a person, not a tool. But you must also be ready. The Inquisitors will stop at nothing to take him." Emily nodded, her heart racing. She had no idea how to prepare for what was coming, but one thing was certain. She couldn't back down now. She had made a promise to Adrian, and to herself, that she would help him no matter the cost. As the king and Adrian left the restaurant, Emily stayed behind, her mind spinning with everything she had just learned. She couldn't help but glance back at the man at the bar. The Inquisitor. What did he know? How far would they go to get what they wanted? The questions swirled in her mind, but there were no answers yet. All she knew was that Adrian needed her. The days that followed were filled with a quiet intensity. Emily found herself spending more time with Adrian, slowly helping him adjust to the world around him. She saw the boy he could be, and it made her more determined than ever to protect him. But the shadow of the Inquisitors loomed large. Every time she looked around, she felt as if they were watching. The tension in the air was palpable, but Emily refused to let fear dictate her actions. She would face whatever came her way, no matter the consequences. It was one evening, a few days later, when the world as she knew it changed forever. The door to the restaurant swung open once more, but this time, it wasn't the king or any other familiar face. It was a group of men in dark suits, walking in with an air of menace. Emily's heart sank as she saw them. The Inquisitors. They were here, and they weren't leaving without Adrian. Her mind raced, but her body moved before she could think. She rushed toward the back of the restaurant, knowing she had to warn the king. But as she reached the door, she found herself face to face with the leader of the Inquisitors. He was tall, with cold eyes that seemed to pierce through her. "Where is he?" the man asked, his voice as cold as his stare. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She had no choice but to face them. But she would protect Adrian, even if it meant putting herself in danger. "He's not here," Emily said, her voice steady despite the fear rising in her chest. "You won't find him." The Inquisitor smiled, a cold, sinister grin that sent chills down her spine. "We'll see about that," he said, and before she could react, they began searching the restaurant. Emily knew she had to act fast. There was no time to waste. The storm was coming, and she would be ready to face it head-on. The storm outside had intensified, but it seemed to mirror the growing tension inside the restaurant. Emily's heart raced as the Inquisitors, cold and calculating, moved through the space with eerie precision. Every moment felt like a countdown, and Emily knew she couldn't waste any more time. She had to protect Adrian, no matter the cost. As the Inquisitors scoured the restaurant, she slipped out of the back door, her steps quick and silent. Her mind was a whirl of thoughts. How could she keep Adrian safe? How could she stop these people from getting to him? She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't let them find him. Her eyes darted around the dark alleyway, and then she saw it, the black car parked just ahead. She didn't think twice. She moved toward the car, her hands shaking as she reached for her phone. Her fingers pressed the numbers quickly, dialing the one person who could help her now. "Vampire King," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're here. The Inquisitors. They've come for Adrian." There was a long pause, and then his voice came through, smooth but tinged with urgency. "I'm on my way. Don't let them see you. Keep Adrian safe." Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was short-lived. She had to move fast. The Inquisitors were still inside, and they were getting closer to finding Adrian. Emily turned and ran back into the restaurant, her mind set on one thing: getting to Adrian before the Inquisitors did. She spotted him almost immediately, standing near the back, his eyes wide with fear. The Vampire King was right. Adrian needed someone who could see him for who he was, not just a tool to be used. Emily rushed toward him, her heart pounding as she approached. Adrian's gaze locked with hers, and she could see the panic in his eyes. "We have to go," Emily said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. Adrian didn't say anything, but his eyes flicked toward the front of the restaurant where the Inquisitors were still searching. Emily took his hand gently, pulling him away from the crowd. They moved quickly, silently, but her mind raced. What would happen when they were caught? Would the Vampire King get there in time? They reached the back door, just as the Inquisitors seemed to be closing in on their location. Emily's heart thudded in her chest as she pushed Adrian ahead of her. "Go," she whispered urgently, pushing him through the door and into the alleyway. Just as she was about to follow him, a voice echoed from behind. "Stop." The command was sharp, cold, and authoritative. Emily spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The leader of the Inquisitors stood in the doorway, his cold eyes locked on her. He had a look of absolute determination, and his presence sent a chill down her spine. "Where do you think you're going?" he sneered. Emily stepped forward, her body tense, ready to face him. She had no weapon, no magic, but she wouldn't let them take Adrian. Not without a fight. "You're not taking him," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the fear creeping into her chest. The Inquisitor smiled cruelly. "You think you can stop us? You're nothing but a servant. You can't protect him." Emily stood her ground, her mind racing. She had no idea what to do, but she knew one thing. She couldn't back down. Not now. Just then, the sound of a car screeching to a halt pierced the air. The Inquisitor's smile faltered for just a moment as he turned his attention to the noise. Emily seized the moment. "Adrian, go!" she shouted, pushing him farther into the alley. Adrian didn't hesitate. He ran, his small feet pounding against the wet pavement, his body disappearing into the shadows. Emily followed close behind, her heart hammering in her chest as she heard the Inquisitor's footsteps growing closer. But just as the Inquisitor reached her, a figure stepped between them. The Vampire King. His presence was like a force of nature, the air around him crackling with power. He stood tall, his eyes glowing with an intensity that made the Inquisitor pause. "I don't think you'll be going anywhere," the king said, his voice cold and filled with authority. The Inquisitor's eyes narrowed, but he didn't move. "You're too late." The Inquisitor spat, but his voice wavered slightly. The Vampire King took a step forward, his gaze never leaving the man in front of him. "Leave now," the king commanded, his voice low but deadly. For a moment, the two men stood there, the tension thick in the air. The Inquisitor seemed to weigh his options, but then, with a final sneer, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the alley. Emily exhaled the breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, her body sagging with relief. The king turned to her, his expression softening slightly as he approached. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle. Emily nodded, though her legs felt weak beneath her. "I'm fine, but we have to get out of here. They'll be back. They won't stop until they get what they want." The Vampire King nodded, his gaze shifting toward the darkened street ahead. "We move quickly. Stay close to me." With that, he led the way, guiding Emily through the back streets and into the safety of the shadows. The world outside felt dangerous, but for the first time since this all began, Emily felt a sense of purpose. She had chosen to protect Adrian, and she would stand by him no matter the cost. The streets were dark and empty as the Vampire King led Emily through the back alleys, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the walls. Every corner they turned felt like another step deeper into a world Emily didn't fully understand, but she knew she couldn't back out now. The king's presence beside her was both comforting and unnerving, powerful, yet distant. His gaze was sharp, always scanning the shadows as though expecting an attack at any moment. Emily felt the weight of his world pressing down on her, but she couldn't let it distract her. Adrian was her focus now. They had to keep him safe. They moved quickly, cutting through narrow streets and hidden passages that Emily had never noticed before. Her heart pounded in her chest as she kept close to the king, trying to keep up with his swift pace. Adrian, though smaller and more vulnerable, was remarkably quiet, his presence almost ethereal in the darkness. For a brief moment, Emily glanced at the boy beside her. His face was calm, but there was a tension in the way he moved, an unspoken fear that seemed to cling to him. He wasn't used to feeling safe, not for a long time, and Emily knew that despite his bravery, he was still just a child. But she would protect him. She had to. As they reached a secluded part of the city, the king stopped suddenly, his posture rigid. Emily followed his gaze and saw a large, dark building ahead. It was taller than the others around it, with no windows visible from the outside and a sense of secrecy that seemed to radiate from every brick. This was where they would stay. The king turned to Emily, his expression unreadable. "We'll rest here for now. It's safe, for the time being." Emily nodded, though a sinking feeling settled in her stomach. She had seen the way the Inquisitors had reacted when they realized Adrian was missing. They wouldn't stop until they found him, and their presence felt like a constant threat that hung over her, Adrian, and even the king. As they entered the building, the cool, musty air inside wrapped around them like a blanket. The space was quiet, the only sound the faint creaking of old wood beneath their feet. The king led them down a narrow corridor, and Emily couldn't help but wonder where they were headed. The deeper they went, the more isolated the place felt. Finally, the king stopped in front of a door and turned to face her. "This will be Adrian's room for now," he said. Adrian's eyes flickered to the door, and for the first time, there was a sense of uncertainty in his gaze. Emily crouched down next to him, offering a reassuring smile. "It's okay," she said softly. "You'll be safe here. No one will hurt you." The boy nodded, but his hands fidgeted nervously, betraying the calm expression on his face. He wasn't used to safety, not after years of being hidden away, treated as a weapon, a prize, or an object of fear. Emily could see the weight of that burden in his eyes. The king gave a brief nod, his face softening just slightly as he looked at Adrian. "You're safe now," he said. "But you must understand, the danger isn't over. The Inquisitors will be back. They'll stop at nothing to take you." Adrian didn't respond. His silence spoke volumes, and for a moment, Emily wished she could somehow take away the years of pain he'd endured. She didn't know what it felt like to be trapped in a life of fear and isolation, but she could see the scars it had left. Emily's resolve hardened. She had already promised to protect him, and she wasn't backing down now. "I won't let them take him," she said firmly, more to herself than to the king. The king's eyes locked onto hers, his expression unreadable. You have a part to play in all of this now, Emily. You can't turn back, but you must know the risks. Emily nodded, her heart racing with both fear and determination. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't asked to be thrust into a world of ancient curses, vampire politics, and dark factions. But now that she was in it, there was no turning back. She wasn't just protecting a boy. She was standing against forces much larger than herself, forces that would stop at nothing to achieve their goal. I'll stay by him, she said, her voice steady. I'll keep him safe, no matter what. The king's gaze softened for a moment, a flicker of something like approval in his eyes. Good, he said, his voice low but firm. Then let's prepare. The battle is coming, and we need to be ready. As he turned to leave, Emily stayed behind for a moment, her thoughts racing. She had no idea what was coming next, but one thing was clear. Her life had already changed in ways she couldn't have imagined. She was in this fight now, and there was no turning back. Her bond with Adrian had been formed in the quietest of moments, and now she would stand by him through whatever came next. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway, but Emily stood still, her heart steeled for the challenges ahead. No matter how dark things got, she knew she couldn't back away. She had made a promise, and she would keep it. The shadows of danger were closing in, but Emily and Adrian were not alone. They had each other, and they would fight together. The days that followed were filled with a growing sense of unease. The hidden building where they had sought refuge was nothing more than a temporary sanctuary. The Vampire King's warning echoed in Emily's mind. The Inquisitors were coming, and the danger was far from over. Adrian, though still silent, seemed more aware of his surroundings. He watched the hallways with careful eyes, his once distant gaze now more focused, more alive. But there was an underlying sadness in him, a weight that only Emily seemed to understand. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the calm before the storm. The king had made it clear that Adrian wasn't just a boy, he was a pawn in a much larger game. And Emily, by extension, was now a part of that game too. That night, as she sat by the window of the room she shared with Adrian, watching the streets below, the door creaked open behind her. The king entered silently, his presence as imposing as ever, yet his face was softer than it had been before. He had been keeping his distance, watching over them both from afar, but tonight was different. You've been quiet, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. Is something wrong? Emily turned to face him, her heart heavy with the uncertainty of their situation. I'm just thinking, she said quietly, about Adrian. And what comes next? The king nodded, stepping closer to her. His eyes were filled with a rare understanding, as though he could feel the weight of her concerns. No, he replied. It's not easy, but you're doing more than you realize. Emily's eyes softened as she looked at him. The last few days had been a whirlwind, and she had no idea how much longer they could stay hidden before the Inquisitors found them. What happens if they do find us? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The king's expression hardened, but he didn't hesitate. We fight, he said simply. We fight, and we protect Adrian with everything we have. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard the stories, the rumors about what the Inquisitors were capable of. They didn't just want to control Adrian. They wanted to break him, to make him into something he wasn't. She couldn't let that happen. I'm ready, she said, her voice steady. I'll do whatever it takes to keep him safe. The king's gaze softened, but there was still a flicker of concern in his eyes. You don't know what you're getting into, Emily, he warned. The Inquisitors are ruthless. They'll stop at nothing. Then we'll stop them first, she replied, her resolve firming. I won't let them take Adrian. I won't let them win. There was a long pause, and then the king gave a small nod, his gaze moving to the door. We'll need to be ready. We don't have much time. If the Inquisitors are coming, they'll be here soon. He turned to leave, but then stopped and looked back at Emily. You're more than just a protector to him now. You're his strength. Emily felt her heart swell at his words, but the weight of his statement also pressed down on her. She wasn't just protecting Adrian anymore. She was standing against an entire faction, an ancient order of powerful individuals who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. The pressure of the situation felt unbearable at times, but Emily wouldn't back down. As she sat there alone in the dimly lit room, she couldn't help but wonder what the next few days would bring. Would they be able to stay one step ahead of the Inquisitors? Or would they finally be caught, trapped in the web of lies and manipulation that had kept Adrian isolated for so long. The door to the room opened again, this time quietly. Adrian stepped inside, his eyes meeting Emily's. There was something different in his gaze now, a quiet understanding, a bond that had formed between them in the short time they had spent together. "Are you okay?" Emily asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. Adrian nodded slowly, but there was still that unspoken fear in his eyes. Emily reached out and gently took his hand, offering a reassuring smile. "We'll get through this," she said softly. "I'm here for you, Adrian. Always." Adrian didn't respond, but his grip on her hand tightened, and for the first time, Emily felt a sense of peace in the storm that surrounded them. They would get through this together. As the days passed, the tension in the air grew thicker. The king had been working tirelessly to prepare for the inevitable confrontation with the Inquisitors. He had assembled a small group of loyal allies, people who would fight for Adrian's freedom. Emily was included in their plans, though she still felt out of her depth. She wasn't a warrior or a strategist. She was just a waitress who had happened to show kindness to a boy who had been neglected by the world. But despite her doubts, Emily knew one thing for certain. She couldn't stand by and let them take Adrian. She wouldn't let him become another casualty in a war he didn't choose. The night before they were set to make their move, Emily found herself standing at the window once again, staring out at the quiet streets below. The sky was clear, the stars shining brightly overhead, but the darkness felt suffocating. She closed her eyes, trying to center herself, trying to push past the fear. Adrian needed her. The king needed her. And she had made a promise. As she turned to leave the room, she was startled by the sound of footsteps approaching. It was the king, his expression grim but determined. "It's time," he said quietly. Emily took a deep breath and nodded. Whatever came next, they would face it together. They had no other choice. The night had settled over the city like a blanket, heavy and still. The distant hum of the streets was muffled by the thick walls of the hidden sanctuary where Emily and Adrian had taken refuge. Inside, the air was tense, charged with anticipation. Emily could feel the weight of what was coming. It wasn't just the Inquisitors, they were part of something much larger, something that had been brewing for centuries. The king, despite his calm exterior, was preparing for a battle he knew could change everything. Emily stood by the window, her hands pressed against the cold glass as she stared out into the darkness. The stars seemed distant, unreachable, much like the future ahead of them. Adrian stood beside her, watching her with a quiet intensity. He hadn't said much in the past few days, but his presence was enough. They didn't need words anymore. They understood each other in ways that went beyond what could be spoken. The door creaked behind them, and the vampire king entered, his expression unreadable. He walked over to them, his steps deliberate. The room felt smaller now, as if the very air itself had thickened with the knowledge of what was to come. "We're ready," the king said, his voice steady but filled with an edge of something darker. Emily turned to face him, her heart pounding. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. "Once we do this, there's no turning back." The king nodded, his eyes locking with hers. "There's never been a choice. They'll come for him, Emily. The Inquisitors will never stop until they've claimed him." Emily's breath hitched at his words. She had known the risks, but hearing it spoken so plainly made it all feel too real. Adrian, who had been silent until now, spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not afraid." The words startled Emily. She turned to look at him, seeing a new strength in his eyes. The boy who had been hiding, the boy who had been treated as a weapon, now stood before her with a courage she hadn't expected. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was fighting for his own freedom. "You should be," the king said, his tone softening as he looked down at Adrian. "But there's no turning back for any of us." Adrian nodded, his small hands clenched into fists. Emily could see the quiet resolve in him. He was no longer just the boy she had promised to protect. He was becoming something more, something stronger. "We fight," Emily said, her voice full of certainty. "We fight for Adrian. We fight for all of us." The king regarded her silently for a moment, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of approval in his eyes. "Then let's go," he said simply. The tension in the room was palpable as they prepared to leave. Adrian stood tall now, a far cry from the boy who had walked in here so unsure. Emily gave him one last look, a silent promise that she would be there, no matter what happened. They made their way down the darkened hallways, their footsteps muffled by the thick stone floors. The king led the way, his movements graceful yet powerful, as though he were preparing himself for something far beyond just a battle. Adrian and Emily followed closely behind, the weight of the situation pressing down on them both. They reached the back of the building, where a hidden exit led to the street beyond. The world outside was cold, and the city lights seemed too distant, as if they were stepping into an entirely different world. The air felt thick with the knowledge of what was at stake. "Stay close," the king ordered, his voice commanding yet calm. Emily nodded, her hand instinctively reaching for Adrian's. The boy grasped her hand tightly, his fingers trembling slightly. Despite his bravery, she knew he was still afraid. They turned onto the street, moving quickly through the shadows, away from the building that had kept them safe. The city around them seemed alive, but in a way that felt dangerous, as if everything was watching them. Emily could sense that the Inquisitors were close. She could feel it in the air, a weight that pressed against her chest with every step. They had made it this far, but how long could they stay ahead of their pursuers? As they rounded a corner, the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. Emily's heart raced. The king stopped abruptly, holding up a hand for silence. The footsteps grew louder, and then, just as suddenly, they stopped. "They're here," the king murmured. Emily's stomach twisted. She glanced at Adrian, whose face had gone pale, but his eyes were still full of determination. "Don't worry," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "We'll be all right." But even as she spoke the words, she wasn't sure. The darkness was closing in, and they were about to face the most dangerous people they had ever encountered. The Inquisitors would stop at nothing to capture Adrian, to use him as a weapon. But Emily would never let that happen. She had already promised to protect him. The king moved forward, his posture changing. The tension in his body was palpable, ready for the fight that was sure to come. Emily took a deep breath and followed him, her hand still tightly clutching Adrian's. This was the moment they had all been preparing for, the moment that would define everything. As they turned the corner, the figures of the Inquisitors came into view, standing in the shadows, their eyes glowing with an unnatural intensity. The time for running was over. The battle had begun. The shadows around them grew thicker, and Emily's heart raced as she stood face to face with the Inquisitors. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, reflecting the dark power that emanated from their very presence. She could feel the weight of their gaze, cold and unyielding, as they sized her up. The king stepped forward, his body tense but his posture controlled. He was ready for what was to come. "You're too late," the leader of the Inquisitors sneered, his voice smooth but filled with venom. "We know you're protecting him, and we will take him back." The Vampire King's eyes flashed with an intensity that sent a chill down Emily's spine. She had never seen him like this, his usual calm and composure now replaced with a fierce determination that radiated from him like an invisible force. "You'll never take him," the king growled, his voice low but filled with authority. "Not while I'm still standing." Emily's breath caught in her throat as the tension between them thickened. She wanted to run, to protect Adrian, but she knew she couldn't leave. The Inquisitors were powerful, ruthless, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. But she couldn't let them take Adrian. Not now, not after everything they had been through. She glanced at Adrian, who was standing beside her, his hand trembling in hers. For a moment, his eyes met hers, and she could see the fear in them, but also something else. A quiet strength that had grown in him over the past few days. He wasn't the same scared boy he had been when they first met. He was ready to fight, too. "Stay close," the king said to Emily, his voice barely a whisper, but it was filled with authority. "If you run, they'll take him." Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. She wasn't going anywhere. The Inquisitors moved closer, their eyes fixed on Adrian, calculating, waiting for the right moment to strike. Emily could feel the weight of their power pressing against her chest, but she refused to back down. "He's just a boy," Emily said, her voice steady despite the fear rising inside her. "You have no right to take him." The Inquisitors laughed, a sound that sent a chill through the air. "A boy? You're so naive," the leader said, his voice dripping with contempt. "He's not just a boy. He's the key to a power greater than you can understand. And we will use him to bring about a new world order." Emily's stomach churned at his words. but she couldn't let them see her fear. Adrian had been through too much. He was not a tool to be used for anyone's gain. "You'll never use him," the king said, his voice growing colder with each word. "Not if I have anything to do with it." Without warning, the Inquisitors lunged forward, their hands outstretched, but the king was faster. In a flash, he was on them, his movements fluid and deadly. The air around him seemed to ripple with power as he struck with precision, his attacks swift and unforgiving. Emily barely had time to process the scene unfolding before her. The Inquisitors were powerful, yes, but they were no match for the Vampire King's strength. He moved with a fluidity that was almost impossible to follow, knocking them back with ease. But Emily knew this wouldn't be over quickly. The Inquisitors were relentless, and they wouldn't give up. Adrian stepped forward, his eyes filled with determination. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she realized what he was about to do. "Stay back," she shouted, but Adrian didn't listen. Instead, he stepped into the fray, his small frame moving with surprising agility as he positioned himself between the king and the Inquisitors. "No," Emily cried, her voice filled with fear. But Adrian's gaze was unwavering. He wasn't going to let them hurt the king. He wasn't going to let them take him. "I'm not afraid," Adrian said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. Emily couldn't believe it. This was the same boy who had been so silent, so afraid, just days ago. And now, he was standing up for the people who had taken him. The people who had shown him kindness when the world had rejected him. Adrian raised his hands, and for a moment, the Inquisitors paused, their eyes narrowing as they realized what he was doing. He was using the silent oath, the very thing they had feared for so long. Emily felt a surge of hope in her chest. Adrian wasn't just a victim. He was powerful in his own right. The king, seeing Adrian step forward, nodded in approval, though his focus remained on the Inquisitors. "That's it," he said quietly. "Show them what you're made of." Adrian's hands moved with confidence now, his gestures sharp and deliberate as he signed commands to the Inquisitors. The air around them seemed to pulse with energy, a force that Emily had never felt before. The Inquisitors stumbled back, their eyes filled with fear and confusion. They had underestimated Adrian, and now they were beginning to realize their mistake. The leader of the Inquisitors growled in frustration, but he knew he was outmatched. "This isn't over," he snarled, his voice dripping with malice. "You may have won this battle, but we will return. The boy will be ours." The king stepped forward, his eyes locked onto the leader. "Not while I still breathe," he said, his voice full of menace. With a final sneer, the Inquisitors retreated into the shadows, their figures disappearing into the night. Emily stood still, her heart still racing from the confrontation, but there was a sense of victory in the air. They had won. For now. As the dust settled, Emily turned to Adrian, her eyes filled with pride. He had stepped into the fight not as a victim, but as a warrior in his own right. She couldn't help but smile, though her heart still ached for the challenges that lay ahead. "You did it," she said softly, reaching out to gently touch his shoulder. Adrian looked up at her, a small, but genuine smile crossing his face. "We did it," he corrected, his voice full of quiet strength. Emily felt a warmth spread through her chest as she realized just how far they had come. But the battle wasn't over. They still had a long way to go, and the Inquisitors would be back. But as long as they had each other, they could face whatever came next. The days following their confrontation with the Inquisitors were filled with a strange kind of tension. The king, though victorious, knew this was only a temporary reprieve. The Inquisitors would return, and when they did, they would come with more force, more power, and more determination. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that their victory had been fleeting, that the calm they were experiencing now was only the eye of the storm. Adrian, however, seemed more at ease. The look in his eyes had changed since the battle. He no longer seemed like a frightened boy, hiding in the shadows. There was a fire in him now, a quiet strength that had grown ever since he first spoke to Emily. He had shown bravery, not only in standing up to the Inquisitors, but in accepting the power that came with his curse. Emily was proud of him, but the weight of the situation was not lost on her. She had promised to protect him, and she would, no matter the cost. As night fell once again over the city, the Vampire King summoned Emily and Adrian to a secret meeting in the lower chambers of the sanctuary. The air was thick with unease, and the dimly lit room was filled with others, loyal allies of the king, people who had been working behind the scenes to keep Adrian safe. The king stood before them, his eyes focused, his posture unyielding. Emily could feel the tension in the room as the king began to speak. The Inquisitors are only the beginning. There are others who want Adrian. There are factions who will use him to control power, and there are those who would see him destroyed, the king said, his voice low and filled with a gravity that sent a chill through Emily's bones. Adrian, standing beside Emily, looked up at the king with quiet determination. He had always known he was different, but now, after everything that had happened, he understood the full extent of the danger he was in. Emily could see the unease in his eyes, but she also saw something else, an acceptance, a willingness to face the challenges ahead. The king turned his gaze to Adrian, his expression softening just slightly. "I will protect you, Adrian," he said firmly. "But you must be prepared for what is to come. We will need to move quickly, and we will need to be united. This is no longer just about survival. It's about taking control of your destiny." Emily looked at Adrian, her heart swelling with pride. He wasn't just the frightened child he had been. He was becoming something more, something powerful. And though the path ahead was uncertain, she knew she would stand by him. The king's voice broke through her thoughts. "Emily, you have proven yourself to be loyal, strong, and resourceful. But the time has come for you to make a choice," he said. Emily looked up, meeting his gaze. She didn't speak immediately. The weight of his words settled in her chest. What choice? What more could she do? The king continued. "I want you to become more than just a protector. I want you to be an ally in this fight. Together, we will make sure Adrian has the future he deserves. We will stop those who want to control him, and we will strike at those who have wronged him." Emily took a deep breath, her mind racing. She had already chosen this path, hadn't she? She had already decided she would protect Adrian, no matter what. But now, the stakes were higher. The danger was greater, and the future was even more uncertain. Still, her resolve didn't falter. She knew she couldn't turn back now. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice steady, filled with the certainty that had grown in her since she first met Adrian. The king gave a nod of approval. "Good. Because what comes next will test everything you know, everything you believe in." The room grew quiet as the king's words hung in the air. Emily felt the weight of their meaning. This wasn't just about protecting Adrian anymore. This was a fight for the future. And Emily was no longer just a bystander. She was part of the battle. "We will start by gathering allies," the king continued. "We have some in the shadows already, those who have been waiting for the right moment to rise. We will need to unite them, and we will need to be swift." Adrian, who had been silent, finally spoke. "What about the others? The ones who are still out there?" His voice was steady, though Emily could hear the fear beneath his words. The king's gaze turned to Adrian, and his expression softened slightly. "We will find them. We will stop them before they have a chance to take control. You will not be alone in this, Adrian. We will fight together." Emily could see the trust in Adrian's eyes as he looked at the king. But there was something else there too. A growing determination. Adrian wasn't just going to let others control him. He was going to take control of his own destiny, and he would do it with those who cared about him. And Emily would be right there beside him. As the meeting concluded, the group dispersed, and Emily and Adrian found themselves alone in the quiet of the room. The weight of the task ahead was heavy, but Emily felt a sense of peace settle over her. They weren't just running anymore. They were fighting for something real, something worth protecting. She turned to Adrian, her heart full. "Are you ready for this?" she asked softly. Adrian nodded, his eyes filled with the same quiet strength that had become so familiar to her. "I'm ready," he said. "We'll fight. Together." And with that, they stepped forward into the unknown, united in their resolve, ready to face whatever came next. The days leading up to their next move were filled with a quiet determination. Emily and Adrian had spent most of their time preparing for the inevitable battle, gathering what little information they could about the Inquisitors and the other factions that might stand against them. The king, though constantly vigilant, had begun to trust them more, recognizing the bond that had formed between Emily and Adrian. It was a strange and quiet strength that filled the room now, an unspoken agreement that they would face whatever came next together. As night fell again, the king called them to a final meeting. This one felt different. There was an urgency in the air now, an unspoken tension that no one could ignore. They had learned that the Inquisitors were preparing to strike soon. The king was not a man who showed emotion easily, but tonight, there was a flicker of something behind his eyes. He knew what was coming, and it was not something he could stop alone. Adrian stood beside Emily, his presence no longer as quiet and uncertain as it had once been. The boy had grown in ways no one could have expected. His strength, once hidden, was now evident in every word he spoke, every action he took. He wasn't just a victim of circumstance anymore. He was becoming a force in his own right. "We have to move tonight," the king said, his voice firm. The weight of his words hung in the air. The Inquisitors are not the only ones after Adrian. They are part of a much larger faction, one that has been pulling the strings for centuries. We can no longer wait for the perfect moment. The time to act is now. Emily felt her pulse quicken. The king was always prepared, always calculating, but this sense of urgency was new. She knew that something was changing. Adrian glanced up at the king, his expression serious but not fearful. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady. "We'll fight. We'll stop them." There was no doubt in his words, no hesitation. Emily could feel the same certainty growing in herself. They had been through so much already, and no matter how powerful their enemies were, they would stand together. The king gave Adrian a small, approving nod before turning to Emily. "You've done more than I could ever have expected. But now, you must know that the danger is real. The people we face will not hesitate. They will do anything to control Adrian." Emily nodded, her throat tight with the weight of his words. She had already promised to protect Adrian, but she hadn't realized just how deep the threat ran. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the rising fear within her. The king turned toward the map on the table, his fingers tracing the route they would need to take. "We need to strike first," he said. "We can't afford to wait for them to come to us. We will take the fight to them." Adrian stepped forward, looking at the map with a focus that Emily admired. He wasn't just the boy they were trying to protect anymore. He was a part of the strategy, a crucial piece of the plan. "Where do we start?" he asked. The king met his gaze. "We start with their headquarters. We know where they are. It's time to take the fight to their doorstep." Emily's heart pounded. This was it. This was the moment they had been preparing for. The king's eyes flickered toward her, seeing the uncertainty in her expression. "I know you're scared, Emily," he said softly, his voice almost gentle. "But remember this. You've already proven you're stronger than you know. You've already shown Adrian that there's hope, that he's not alone." The words felt like a weight being lifted from her shoulders. She had been afraid of what would happen if they failed, but the king was right. She had already shown Adrian something no one else had: hope. And now it was time to show him the rest of the world. The plan was set. That night, they would move under the cover of darkness, striking swiftly and decisively. The king had gathered his allies, people who had been waiting for the right moment to join the fight. They would storm the Inquisitors' headquarters, and they would do everything in their power to make sure Adrian remained free. The group moved swiftly through the night, Emily staying close to Adrian, her heart in her throat. They moved like shadows, silent and purposeful, knowing that each step brought them closer to danger. But despite the fear, there was also a sense of purpose in the air. Emily could feel it, the certainty that they were doing the right thing. Adrian, walking by her side, was no longer just a frightened child. He was a warrior in his own right, ready to face the enemies who had tormented him for so long. They reached the outskirts of the headquarters, the towering building looming before them like a dark monolith. The king gave the signal, and they moved in, their steps quick and coordinated. There was no turning back now. Emily's heart raced as they approached the gates. She glanced at Adrian, who gave her a small, determined nod. They were ready. Together, they would take down the shadows that had haunted Adrian's life. Together, they would end the reign of those who sought to control him. The king turned toward them, his eyes flashing with determination. "This is the beginning," he said. "And no matter what happens, we fight until the end." The sound of their footsteps echoed in the dark, signaling the start of the final battle. It was no longer a fight for survival. It was a fight for freedom. And this time, they would win. The final battle unfolded faster than Emily could process. The air around them crackled with tension as they moved through the Inquisitors' headquarters, silent but determined. Each step brought them closer to the heart of the enemy's stronghold, but the stakes were higher than they had ever been. This wasn't just about protecting Adrian anymore. It was about ending the cycle of manipulation and control that had kept him a prisoner for so long. They had already lost so much time. The king led the charge, his movements fluid and precise, a force of nature in human form. His allies, too, were moving with purpose, covering their flanks and ensuring no one was left behind. Emily stayed close to Adrian, her hand gripping his as they moved through the corridors, the heavy silence only broken by the distant sounds of footsteps and the occasional murmur of voices. Emily couldn't help but notice the change in Adrian. His once timid demeanor had been replaced by an unspoken determination, a resolve to see this through no matter the cost. She had watched him grow, had watched him come into his own, and now, he was not just a survivor. He was a fighter. They reached the central chamber of the headquarters, a massive room filled with dark stone walls and ornate furniture, like something out of a nightmare. At the far end of the room stood the Inquisitor leader, his face twisted in a sneer, waiting for them. "You think you've won?" he said, his voice low and menacing. "You've only delayed the inevitable. Adrian will belong to us, one way or another." Emily could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the weight of his words hanging in the air. But she wasn't afraid anymore. Not with Adrian by her side, not with the king leading the way. The king stepped forward, his voice calm but powerful. "You're wrong," he said, his eyes burning with an intensity that made the Inquisitor step back slightly. "This ends now. Adrian is not a tool for your gain. He is a person, and you will not control him." The Inquisitor leader's lips curled into a twisted smile. "You're too late. The ritual is already in motion. Adrian's power is bound to us, whether he accepts it or not. You cannot stop what has already begun." Emily glanced at Adrian, who stood next to her, his body tense but his eyes clear. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't going to let them win. The king moved forward, his form a blur of speed and power, closing the distance between himself and the Inquisitor leader in a flash. The fight that followed was brutal, the air heavy with the clash of power as the king fought with a fury that only centuries of anger and pain could fuel. Emily, though not a fighter, stood by Adrian, ready for whatever came next. She had promised to protect him, and she would not falter now. The room filled with the sound of fighting, of steel meeting steel, as the king and the Inquisitor leader clashed in a battle of wills. Emily's heart raced as she watched the fight unfold. Adrian stepped forward, his small hands outstretched, his eyes locked on the Inquisitor leader. Emily could feel the energy in the room shift as Adrian began to draw from the very power the Inquisitors had tried to control. He was no longer just a boy who had been manipulated. He was a force of his own now. The air around him began to hum with energy, a palpable wave of power that seemed to push against the walls of the room. "You cannot control me," Adrian shouted, his voice filled with defiance and strength. The Inquisitor leader's eyes widened as the power within Adrian began to surge. The ritual that had been meant to bind Adrian to their will was now backfiring, the power instead flowing from Adrian to push back against the dark force that had tried to claim him. The king's eyes locked onto the leader, who now looked frail, his own power weakening in the face of Adrian's growing strength. "It's over," the king said, his voice firm as he struck the final blow, sending the Inquisitor leader crashing to the ground. With one last burst of energy, the dark power that had threatened to consume Adrian dissipated, and the room fell silent. Adrian stood still, his body glowing with the residual energy, his chest heaving with exertion. Emily rushed to his side, her heart still pounding in her chest. "Adrian, are you all right?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded slowly, the exhaustion evident in his eyes, but there was a sense of peace in his expression. "I'm free," he said quietly. "It's over." Emily smiled, relief flooding her. They had done it. They had stopped the Inquisitors and taken control of their own fate. The king approached them, his face unreadable but his eyes softer than they had been before. "You did well," he said to Adrian, a rare expression of approval crossing his face. "You've broken the chains that held you." Adrian looked at him, his gaze filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply. The king nodded, then turned to Emily. "And thank you," he said, his voice full of respect. "You were more than just a protector. You were the key to everything." Emily felt a rush of pride, but also a sense of finality. The battle had been won, but the journey wasn't over. They had fought for Adrian's freedom, and now, together, they would build a future free from fear. As they left the Inquisitor headquarters, the night air felt different, lighter somehow. Adrian, once a boy bound by his past, was now free. And Emily, once just a waitress caught in a world beyond her understanding, had become something far greater. Together, they walked into a new beginning, ready to face whatever challenges the future would bring, knowing that they had already conquered the greatest battle of all, one for freedom and one for each other. Vampire stories have always captivated readers with their dark and thrilling tales of power, mystery, and danger. This gripping narrative takes you on a journey through a world where a young boy, cursed and bound by his heritage, finds the strength to break free from those who seek to control him. With the help of those who truly see him for who he is, including a fierce protector, this story explores themes of freedom, loyalty, and the fight against overwhelming odds. As the Inquisitors close in, the characters must confront their deepest fears and fight for survival. The king, who is not just a leader but also a father figure, stands alongside the boy in a final battle to protect him from the sinister forces threatening their world. With every step, the characters push against the darkness that seeks to trap them, making for an epic tale of survival and empowerment. This powerful story adds a unique twist to traditional vampire stories, blending personal growth with action-packed adventure, as the protagonist learns to control the power within him. The journey is filled with unexpected turns, as Emily, the unlikely hero, finds herself in a world far more dangerous than she ever imagined. This modern take on vampire stories is a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the bonds that hold us together. With stakes higher than ever, the story builds to a climactic battle where nothing will ever be the same. If you're a fan of vampire stories with strong character development, unexpected heroes, and an unforgettable battle between light and dark, this tale will keep you on the edge of your seat until the very end.